So just kind of beginning, hello. My name is Jillian Mae Seversky. I'm a senior art education major here at App. My studio practice is super important to me, and I've been kind of accumulating and making throughout my time here at App. This exhibition, What Tumbles Out, Reflections on Reverence, and experiencing this with me today, just like to say thank you again from me, and like choosing to spend your time and be here with me tonight in my artworks. A little background about how I kind of got into clay and making art. I sort of came up just being really fascinated with material. There's this story that my mom and dad will often tell to neighbors and friends about me, like taking tissues and tape and like making strange objects. And that's something I kind of always come back to. So yeah, and I ended up actually finding clay during high school class. And then when I came here to App, kind of due to our amazing faculty and the wonderful generosity that they had, I kind of began working more in depth with it and thinking about the content and the materialness of it. And it just really found me in a time where so much was uncertain. My family and mom and dad decided actually to move to Florida from where we had lived our whole lives in North Carolina, my senior year of high school. And so there's just like this undercurrent of instability, and clay kind of met me and allowed me to feel stable, allowed me to kind of build my own ground and plant my feet into something that was like really tangible. So yeah, that's just kind of like the importance of art and the materiality of clay that we're kind of sitting in this room together. First, I'd also like to talk a little bit about technique and methodology and kind of get a glimpse behind the curtain of actually how my making works. So yeah, kind of as you look around the room, you'll get a sense that the materials of these work are kind of pieced together in sort of like a collaged like manner. The materials that are super present in my work include things like metal, ceramic, found object, mixed media. Some specific highlights of the mixed media pieces are my mother's vinyl record in that piece over there, a pair of checkered Vans that I actually wore taking my driver's test, and like even my old phone charger. So with these mixed media inclusions, I try to really embed like a personal and cultural meaning into the work, and they really carry a sense of memory and identity in the work, transforming it to kind of more than just a form, so it kind of becomes a vessel of my lived experience. And so these objects are just a really tangible tie to that. Metal is also found both in the ceramic pieces and then some of the pieces on the wall that are more hands-on wearable pieces, like jewelry. These can be found embedded in the ceramic sculptures and standing alone as wearable jewelry. And this material kind of highlights a tension between vulnerability and resilience, and it kind of also calls into question some essence of like decoration and excess, like what is dripping off, what can you tell by things that people adorn themselves with. So that kind of first showed up in these two works over here, like these hanging objects with nichrome wire, and then transferred into some of the more jewelry pieces over there. So yeah, kind of those wearables, specifically the earrings and necklace, just really physically connect the artwork to the individual. So there's this sense of like adornment and a skin-to-skin contact, and the ability to kind of collapse the boundary between art and body. So as you're remembering, you're also interacting with it physically. So it kind of becomes like a lived presence in the artwork rather than like a separate display that you'll see in some of these wall pieces. And also these heirlooms these jewelry pieces also kind of function as the role of heirlooms. So exploring what it means to create one's own heirloom with the memories that I have from the people and family members around me, and also the limitations of those heirlooms to hold kind of time and memory. Ceramic also stands as a kind of ever-present visitor in this exhibition. The red iron-rich clay that you can see pretty prominently in some of my sculptures kind of functions as this like underpainting or like canvas. And it also ties to the work of earth and blood and ancestral histories. And it just has a really beautiful hue that I'm really drawn to, and references a lot of ancient clay traditions in Mexico and Mesoamerica that I have personal cultural ties to. All these sculptures or the ceramic sculptures are all hollow built, so it kind of just allows me to maintain like a lot of lightness and allow for volume and scale. It's also really important to me that I'm able to move all these pieces myself, so I can physically pick them up. So that's kind of why I choose to hollow build, and also allows me to emphasize like negative space, and allows the viewer to kind of take it to the full breath, like the movement that's happening with some of these forms in the pieces. Surfacing wise, I'm using a combination of multiple layers of underglaze, glaze, cold finishing techniques like acrylic paint. Usually I'll underglaze even before the work goes into the kiln. Kind of allows me to just sort of map out my ideas and map out the color palettes before firing. I oftentimes won't go into the pieces with a specific color palette in mind. I'll sort of let it talk to me. Or they'll be influenced by the colors of some of the objects that are present. So yeah, pre-firing layer kind of helps me like create a conversation with the piece before it even goes into the kiln. And sometimes this is more playful, sometimes it's more muted. And then the glazes will come in after it's been fired for the first time and create like a sort of depth of sheen and shine in the piece. I'm also using a variety of different kinds of glazes. You'll see they're sort of intermingled and mixed. I'm not so worried about glazes flowing into each other. There are kind of no set boundaries in this work. Oftentimes you'll see clear glaze, a chrome glaze, a confetti glaze, and like a blue stain and a maiolica glaze. So these just kind of converse on the surface side by side with each other. Also more specifically to mention the maiolica glaze tradition, that's something that is kind of a through line of a lot of my pieces. This is actually a super rigid glaze, so usually where you put it, it stays. It doesn't flow so much. And a little history about that is that it's often used to kind of, or was historically used to like trick people into thinking that it was a Chinese or a Japanese, like that classic blue and white porcelain that you see. So no one knew how they were getting that like really white and blue surface. And so in order to try and recreate that and trick people into thinking that it was true porcelain from China and Japan, you will see this maiolica tradition like found in a lot of Mesoamerican areas, as well as like England and UK area, because they just couldn't figure out how to do it, which I think is really interesting and also brings back ties to the ways that we present ourselves to the world, and how that can be a true or accurate depiction, or if we care about being true or accurate. Also, there's kind of like this sense of like reproduction and inquiry into the way that we present ourselves in our stories, so like really using those historical techniques to kind of acknowledge this like interconnectedness and like this conversation and language of ceramics, because ceramics has been happening for millions of years. So I felt and feel like it's important so to have a conversation with the works that are happening, and the works that people have made before me. I also will use wax. You'll kind of see like a semi-gloss, semi-matte appearance. It's on that soap piece up there on the extension cords and things like that. And it just creates like a kind of, that's like a, oftentimes like a final finishing that we'll go into. I use a heat gun to apply that, and it like creates like a sense of you have this the bareness of the bisqueware, the bareness of the clay, then you have a semi-gloss of the wax, and finally a gloss of the glaze. And so having kind of these three truths be evident in the pieces is really important to me, and really picking and choosing where they show up, I think creates a lot of visual interest and emphasis, like in the depths and in the crevices. Sometimes use acrylic as well. So I really like, very surprisingly, the super cheapo acrylics from like Walmart, because they have this wonderful matte-ness that like allows for like kind of this tricking of the eye. So again, you'll have this like sense of trick and playfulness that's also evident in my work that references again like that history of Mesoamerica. And then you also have historical narratives that are present and that call back to Mexican ceramic vessels. So oftentimes my pieces will, or all of the times, my pieces will kind of call back to narrative imagery. So Mexican ceramic vessels have a history of using myth, of using ritual, of using daily life scenes, things like transformation happening. And so I'm continuing this on my works. There's this sort of like narrative imagery and narrative journey that's happening. And instead this time I'm embedding my own contemporary personal stories and seeing how these vessels are kind of both functioning as historical texts, but also possibly functional in an emotional sense rather than a physical sense, although I do have elements of things like the idea of cup or like the idea of something holding something else. So yeah, and there's other ceramic languages happening. The piece behind me has feet and it has a handle, and that allows me to pick it up and move it, but also calls back to functional things like mugs and like that intimateness that's happening. And then also you have other things like this body of the vessel and the human form, and like the idea of a cup kind of consuming or offering. So you'll see some of the objects that are present being consumed or being offered perhaps to the viewer. And this is just sort of like almost an anthropomorphic quality that it sort of has taken. So it like is inviting a questioning of connection and storytelling and community. And it just really explores like this physical, tangible reminders of history, both in a very historical sense, but also a contemporary and personal familial sense to me, and that overarching context of both of them. And so yeah, like kind of when, when trying to write this talk, I noted this idea of like a through line of storytelling. So when trying to write this talk, I just kept on coming back and back to this idea of storytelling, and really the ability of clay to kind of preserve memory in a way of things that we decorate and use to decorate ourselves, and the things that we carry with us, just like retaining and preserving and not only holding questions, but asking questions to us. So like some questions that came up to me in terms of storytelling were, who gets the privilege of telling stories? Why are they told in the first place? Can the telling of a story allow for closure or reparations? Are stories told in order to achieve a certain result? And how can we kind of reconcile multiple perspectives of a story, because there's always multiple perspectives. And then also like, how does the telling of a story, does it relinquish or does it establish power? And how does that depend on who's telling it? Is it an institution telling a story? Is it a family telling a story? Is it an individual telling a story? And like this exchange and question of if stories are an exchange of power, or if they're kind of a laying open of vulnerability. And then these questions of storytelling and the connection of how these pieces tell my story, even in the context of the world that we live in today, do I myself deserve to tell my own story? So functioning as a person in a country kind of responsible for like the historical genocide of Native peoples and the stealing of their land, and a country kind of built on the oppression of people, and the country that kind of strips away rights from people, kind of as we're actively seeing that vanish, and just like the state of the country and how it kind of has become leveraged on like creating this division and this divide that I feel like is so palpable, and like the story that is not only like historically being told, but actively being told and rewritten and being changed. And just thinking about how those stories and the stories that are kind of coming to light isn't a new story, but it's an existing story, and it's one kind of that has been just lying here and is now out in the open. I also want to acknowledge that those were some big questions that I just asked, and they take up a lot of space, and they're heavy and overwhelming, and most days they're also really impossible for me to kind of wrap my head around, and for me to grasp. And to be really honest, a lot of days and a lot of times I don't really have space or time to take in the full weight of those questions. And I think I, like many others, kind of distract myself. I have a job to go to, a traffic to get stuck in, rent to pay, errands to run, health insurance claims to file, and a tiny screen that distracts me pretty well. And I think this is really by design. Distracted populace is one that, sorry, I lost my place. Distracted populace is one that has no time for question asking, has no time for revolution. And so I kind of want to start also, before I dive in really heavily into the content, to acknowledge this like culture of hustle, and acknowledge also that, and invite you all, I guess, perhaps, to ruminate with me. Because for me, I think rumination and rest is also a form of revolution. So it's really important to me, before we get into talking about the content, to also invite you to indulge with me in the beauty of asking questions and in the beauty of acknowledging things even when they're difficult, and just like the established essentialness of acknowledgement of the way that we live and the experiences that are actively happening, as well as the historical context of how we're living our lives, and like how we can kind of bear the weight of it all, and to kind of let the heaviness and the grief be something that we're dealing with collectively, rather than to kind of shove it down and experience. So I really hope that tonight we can acknowledge it together and bear witness with it together. And just, I think, in the making and in the reflection of these pieces too, I've really noticed that these are questions that will kind of sustain, and will be questions that pop up in a lot of my work, and also the reality that they don't have an easy solution, or a solution that I will probably maybe see in my lifetime. And so where does that leave us? I think that leaves us in a really convoluted kind of in-between. And I find myself there a lot. And I think the part that I keep on coming back to, and the part that is incredibly essential in my consistent fixation and desire to keep making, is this questioning and this consideration and aim to do more good than harm, and to care about others, and not just to care about others, but to possibly offer some sense of relief or essence of feeling seen to other people. And so I think just the first step of that is to name the content and the context of the suffering, which we just did together, and to like give this grief voice and kind of seek out small moments of joy, and just really acknowledge that joy is not detached from the experiences and the pain that we're having. It's sort of a completely intertwined and interwoven and that is quite present in a lot of the pieces, where you'll see kind of blurred edges and things sinking and falling, and like this unknown but maybe this unknown narrative on the piece that perhaps might lead to more observation. So kind of hearing these works, diving a little bit more into the content, these questions and this pain and this grief, but also this joy, kind of manifests as imbuing really big frustrations into everyday objects. Some examples of this are kind of the state of the US healthcare system into syringes and vital monitor that's slightly filtered in the piece behind me, drains and spigots, standing in for how I carry around my little kid grief in a grown-up body, in the piece kind of right behind over there. Orange juice, soap suds, and pencils as stand-ins and pillars of sustained anxiety and the ritual of day-to-day. IUDs, pills, bread clips, outlets, electrical cords, a nod to connection point, and an acknowledgement of shared and lived experiences. These are all tangible tethers for me to my ancestors, people that came before me, and my life as a result of their choices to survive, to flee, or rather this serendipitous chance of being at the right place in the right time, of catching the right train, of having enough gas left in the tank when the evacuation orders arrives. And what is left, another question that's really important for me and has kind of stood out is also the question of what is left when you have to leave your heirlooms behind. So for me personally, I don't have a lot of family heirlooms, kind of due to my grandmother having to flee and immigrate. And so when memory kind of becomes the point of contact, when you kind of have only that, what happens? What do you have? What are you kind of left with? So for me, I've kind of turned to things like my grandmother's sewing scissors and thimbles and the tops of Play-Doh containers that are just really potent memories for me when growing up and being in her home. So like how do these things and where do these things kind of sustain in my childhood consciousness? They don't sustain, I think, in a clear way. Sometimes they're overturned. Sometimes they're like blurred. And so I think that in these works, they kind of bring together and allow me as well as the viewer to kind of admire and explore with a sense of wonder. So I think, well, yes, it is about the objects and where they have been, what's left behind, and what kind of will rot and what will root into the ground. It is about the objects, but it's not about the objects. It's about my experience with the objects, but it's also about your experience with the objects. It's about people and about family and how they're kind of the only ones that we have for as long as we have. And I think in these works have been imbued with a determination to kind of carry that with me, to hold kind of what is precious and slipping away, that it feels very much kind of all at once with us, and not with us, that there is sort of this acknowledgement that I am still with my family and with my ancestors and with the kids that I ran around with in the backyard, but I'm also an adult. And I'm exploring and I'm making mistakes and I'm creating new memories and new heirlooms for myself. So more specifically, also these artworks kind of exist as this like this meaning of storytelling as it kind of doesn't exist in the now, but also the past and the future, and kind of how this will carry forward and how my personal identities are unfolding and are being discovered by me. One thing I also came back to when thinking about storytelling is I think of one of the first stories that we share when we meet someone new, and ask, where are you from? And to me, it's just a very strange question. I've always not really known how to answer it. in part because I feel like I'm from everywhere and also from nowhere. So to give a little context to that, my grandmother is from Guadalajara, Mexico, and she immigrated to Wisconsin, and my mother was born and raised there and had very limited interaction and exposure to her Mexican and our Mexican culture and heritage. So it kind of just became in this like one great fell swoop that we became American now. And they're just kind of created this like familial chasm and this kind of grand miscommunication that has kind of sustained until me. And so kind of hardly any remnants of a lot of our culture and a lot of our language remain in my family. And so you have this context of my mother with her mother immigrating, and then you also have my father who grew up in upstate New York. It was very cold and bleak, and his childhood was kind of marked by a similar loss and lack of opportunity, which eventually coaxed him to enter the military. And so there's kind of this new loss that bloomed for him, and one that was an undercurrent of my childhood when he came to sort of the realization of dealing with a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder and the way that kind of a country can abandon you despite you putting on your life on the line for them. And then there was this convergence of these two people, this meeting of my parents in California, and so they were kind of encouraged to kind of try and forge something new for themselves as they do. So there was this possibility of doing something on their own, and maybe also like the acknowledgement of the want for this idea of the American dream that perhaps also ignited some desires in my grandmother. So there in California, my sister was born, and then 9/11, and then the War on Terror, and then me, and then the 2008 financial recession, and it seemed like things just kept happening. And so this is kind of my growing up, pieces and parts of my growing up. One marked with a lot of pain, but also still, somehow, somewhere, an undercurrent of joy. And I found myself and my family found ourselves moving yet again to rural North Carolina. So I found joy. My parents created a great life of joy for me, and I ran around and played in sprinklers and rode my bike and drank root beer and played board games with my sister and blew up birthday candles and took standardized tests. And on some days, I dug my fingers into the really red dirt and red earth that's really palpable and that you know is in the ground of North Carolina if you've dug into the earth here. And I think that on some kind of like interconnectedness level, there was this effort of kind of wanting to shape the clay in the same way that my ancestors did. And I just really enjoyed experimenting and playing and getting dirty. And so, I just started thinking about this like sustained duality of my parents dealing with this big, great grief and this big, great effort to make something and to have a family, and the acknowledgement of that and how that, without knowing, crept in to some of my life. And so, like that duality, I think, is another underpainting of my work because it was present so much in my childhood. So this is like a constant exploration for me in my art making, as well as my day-to-day living, where I'm just having this reflection of self alongside familial histories and how context and exploration adds a lot to how we interact and notice the people around us, because it's often a more complicated one than you can kind of ever realize. I think all of this is just a reminder that we can't really protect ourselves from hardship and that to survive, we must seek this joy, and must try to kind of let what's complicated and interwoven be complicated and interwoven, to kind of really sit with the people and things around us and let them kind of sink or fall or be consumed. So this idea of absorption and of expelling memory and object is kind of a really stark visual in my work, and it kind of takes like many forms. You have like this cloud bubble that takes many shapes, both like physically in the room but also emotionally, and it actually developed from like a sketching practice on a lot of the fog that crawls over the mountains in Boone. When I moved here, I think I was sort of looking for something to grab onto, so I started drawing the fog and the way that it creeps over the mountains and the hills and the valleys and sinks into it. But then it also made me really remember waiting for the bus early at, waiting for the school bus early at the bus stop, and like this morning mist that kind of hung over the air. And like there was this slow crawling forward, and it felt almost like creature-like. And so you'll see kind of this like inward, like outward push, and this like sense of movement and absorption that I think talks to a lot of the pieces, and like this kind of constantness of what is being shown and what is being covered up, and what do we show and what do we cover up. But yeah, I kind of wanted to go into a really brief timeline, and then I'll hop into some questions if you guys have questions. But kind of first, what the timeline of this piece, of these pieces, because they're all pieces that I've made at my time here at App. And so the fire extinguisher over in the corner, that is the cloud form that started it all. I was thinking about the fog. I was thinking about this like movement, and there was this piece where I was acknowledging object, but then also thinking about the way that cloud and like this both inhalation but exhalation can interact with objects around it. And from that kind of spurred these two pieces over here, which one is a cup, a more interpretive cup. And this kind of just started to think about like this form. You have this kind of branching out, and this like, I'm not conforming to the gravity. They're like, these pieces are branching out and kind of not really choosing to indulge in reality, where some of the other pieces that are more developed are kind of referencing a little bit of this like lean, or this like sideways movement, or this like falling, versus like there's sort of this sticking out over here. And you'll see a lot more of the red clay present on those pieces. And then we'll have some of these wall works as well, that kind of just began experimenting with this sense of both gravity, but then also ignoring of gravity, but more intentionally, and the exploration of canvas and how one engages with canvas and engages with display. And then the spigot floor works over there, as well as the TV piece, kind of are very heavily reliant on a specific time in memory, and so they kind of show up in a specific setting, in a specific place, and are kind of more physically grounded in a way that I think some of the other pieces are just combining there too. And yeah, also another thing that's really important for me too is you'll see a lot of glaze on the surface, but you'll also see some undulation of texture and form. So oftentimes I will, some of my studio mates know that you'll find me throwing clay up against the wall, or going out into the yard and pressing clay into the ground. And so that sort of rose from wanting to really physically consecrate and impress and like create like a spontaneous like intersection of playfulness, but then also to preserve these moments and these experiences that I was having. So like in this piece kind of talks a little bit about my parents in California, me now in North Carolina, and then my parents now in Florida. And so there are seashells and sand that were impressed into the texture of this piece. So also questioning how physical textures, not just objects, can explore this and preserve this sense of memory. But yeah, I think overall, I really aim to create like this intersection of playfulness and accessibility to the viewer with serious topics. I really enjoy that you can come to the piece and be like, oh, that's a license plate, cool, and walk away. Or you can sit and explore with the piece. But yeah, that was a very brief explanation of some of my works. And I just also want to give some time for questions. If you have any specific questions for me about this work, or you want me to go more in depth about any of the pieces, I'm very willing to. And again, thank you so much for listening to me and spending time to